So a couple of months ago we got a sneak peek of the new Moto Guzzi V100 Mandello, but the details were relatively sparse. The good news is that this week at EICMA, Moto Guzzi announced more details of this beautiful looking new machine that celebrates 100 years of the company. And I've got to say that I'm thoroughly impressed with it. It looks really modern and has some genuinely good hardware, as well as some interesting and innovative tech. So much so that it has to be the most advanced motorcycle they've ever made, certainly in terms of performance and capability. It's head and shoulders above anything in the current lineup, and so in this video we'll go through all of the specs and I'll tell you everything you need to know about it, including those very interesting adaptive aerodynamics. But before we get started, a shout out to one of my channel sponsors, Beeline Moto, for their very generous Black Friday promotion. Not only do they have a few bundles live on the site which will save you a bit of money, but also they're giving 5% of their total sales over this weekend to an incredible charity, NABD. That's the National Association for Bikers with a Disability, and essentially they give grants to bikers who need to make mods to their bike so that they can keep riding, which I think is a great cause. I don't think any of us would ever want to give up the ability to go for a blast on a sunny day, but the specialist equipment and the work to make the adaptations can be expensive, and that's exactly where NABD help out. You can help out too by buying direct from the Beeline website this weekend. It's a genuinely brilliant little navigation device, so there's a link in the description as well as to their blog post with more information about the charity. But first up with the bike, the new compact block engine, which is typical of a Moto Guzzi in some ways. It's a 90-degree transverse V-twin with a shaft drive, but they've designed this one from the ground up to make it as small and light as possible. In fact, it's 103mm shorter in length than the small block engine you'll find in the V85 TT, which is pretty substantial. Another big change is that the cylinder head is rotated by 90 degrees, so you won't see any air intakes or fuel injectors coming out of the back. They're now in the middle of the bike, and of course you've got the exhaust headers on the side instead of the front. Moto Guzzi say this design decision was made in order to increase onboard comfort, so I guess more space for your knees behind the cylinder heads and maybe a bit less heat from them as well, and also rationalize the positioning of the components for the intake and electronic injection systems. In terms of capacity, it comes in at 1042cc and features 4 valves per cylinder with a chain driven double overhead camshaft with finger followers. It's worth adding that it's liquid cooled as well, uses a wet sump lubrication system and also a wet clutch with a hydraulic lever. So all pretty modern when you set it against their typical air-cooled pushrod 2-valve engines. The result is pretty good in terms of power output, so 115 horsepower peak and 105 newton meters of peak torque. They also say that 90% of the torque is available right down from 3,500 RPM, with the rev limiter kicking in up at 9,500. There's no specifics on where the peak power and peak torque occur, but it sounds like a really usable amount of grunt for this sort of bike, which is part sporty but also built with a bit of comfortable touring in mind. It's hard to say how it compares to the competition because there aren't really that many sporty naked roadster tourers left on the market. Adventure bikes have kind of taken over as the default all-rounder, but on the face of it I think it sounds pretty decent for the general road use it's intended for. Power is delivered to the rear wheel through a shaft drive, as is typical of a Guzzi, but this one is positioned much lower than any of their previous designs. There are some clear benefits of shaft drive, so less chain maintenance and cleaning and lubing, but they can suffer from what's known as shaft jacking, which isn't what you might first think. It's when the suspension sits up a little when you get on the throttle. Some bikes like the BMW Boxers or the Triumph Tiger 1200 use a sort of power lever design to combat it, but Moto Guzzi say that this new position does away with any suspension reaction owing to the transfer of torque with no need for a linkage on the swing arm. Either way, it's very nicely designed. On the one side you've got this beautiful swing arm with the offset monoshock, and on the other, well, it's single-sided, so you can admire that snowflake style rear wheel with an uninterrupted view. Bellissima! As for the chassis, we've got a steel tubular frame which no doubt is helped by that shorter engine to limit the wheelbase to 1486mm. That's a little shorter than the V85 TT for example, and they say it's designed to offer excitement through turns and fast sections, but also real stability over more long-range trips. So a bit of an all-rounder as expected, and in the higher trim you also get OHLINS Smart EC2 semi-active suspension. This will automatically change the damping to react to the riding conditions, so it ensures that it's always optimally set in real time. That should mean that it firms up when you're pushing the bike through corners, but it can also soften up for more comfort when cruising in a straight line. Braking comes in the form of Brembo's radially mounted 4-pot calipers on what look like 300 300 or 320mm discs, and there's a Brembo radial master cylinder with a matching hydraulic clutch. It also looks like it might be a 4-piston caliper at the rear, or at very least it's a 2. Either way, it should be good for 2-up riding with luggage on a sporty bike like this, where you might want a little more power and feel at the rear to balance out the front. Then we've got these spoke wheels, which I've already said I think they look very nice indeed, and they're shod with Pirelli Diablo Rosso 4 tyres. That should give it a nice sporty feel, with Pirelli describing them as super sport tyres for the road. So yeah, it should be able to hustle a bit, but also comfort and range and distance riding have also been front of mind when designing this bike. Firstly, they say it has a generous saddle, hard to gauge from just looking at it, but it does seem to be relatively well padded and spacious, and then it also gets a flat handlebar which leads to a relaxed riding position. They also say that 2-person travel is at the base of the project, so there's a fairly spacious pillion seat and some decent grab rails which make a huge difference to the passenger feeling secure, especially when you're riding at a good clip. You've also got the electronically adjustable windscreen, which is a very nice feature on a bike of this size. Those are usually reserved for big touring bikes or large capacity adventure bikes, and then you also get this world first of an adaptive aerodynamic system. So there's a couple of deflectors, and they either raise up or go down based on your current speed and which riding mode is selected, which we'll talk about more in a second. They say that fully raised, these little wings reduce air pressure on the rider by 22%, and they're saying that this leads to the wind protection feeling much more similar to a bigger sporty tourer. The only reservation I've got here is that they don't really say what the benefit of having them down would be. Wouldn't it just be cheaper to fit some fixed deflectors and have that 22% better wind deflection all the time? My guess is that it might be to cool yourself down if you're riding on a particularly hot day, or if you just prefer the feel of a naked bike. I mean, sometimes a bit of wind blast can add to the drama of a quick ride. Either way, there are some other nice practical features. So a 17.5 litre fuel tank, and although they don't state a consumption figure yet, it doesn't sound like a particularly thirsty engine given the power figures. So a couple of hundred easy motorway miles ought to be doable with a steady wrist. Heated grips come as standard on the premium version of this bike, and then there's also a luggage accessory, so a couple of side cases, and they've got integrated supports, so no need for some big frames. In terms of tech, well, it's thoroughly up to date. There's a ride-by-wire throttle and a 6-axis inertial measurement unit, so ABS is cornering sensitive, and they didn't specify about traction control, but I'd imagine that's lean sensitive too. The rider can choose from 4 riding modes, so travel, sport, rain and road, and each one will affect 3 levels of engine map, 4 levels of traction control, 3 levels of engine braking, and also the OHLINS electronic suspension is tied in too. Both models get a 5-inch full color TFT dash, and cruise control comes as standard, but the premium top spec version gets the quick shifter as standard as well, and then Moto Guzzi's MIA phone connectivity system. They say that it includes both the infotainment system for management of the voice assistant, phone calls and music via the switchgear, but also the GPS function, which allows the rider to view directions directly on the instrument panel once the destination is set on the smartphone. Quick question though, is MIA really a good acronym? A good acronym to use for a navigation system? I think that one must have got lost in translation. Last upon the tech, we've also got cornering sensitive LED headlights. So there's 2 extra lights that will illuminate the inside of a turn when the inertial measurement unit detects the bike's banking or leaning over. To go from producing bikes like the V7 and V85 TT right up to this, which has pretty much all of the features you'd expect from a modern sporty naked bike, is pretty impressive. Still no price on this one though, but Moto Guzzi, well, they don't tend to be the cheapest, but they're not extortionate either. With all the OHLINS and tech, you'd probably expect it to come in around the 15 grand mark, perhaps a little more, although we will see the standard version with mechanically adjustable suspension and fewer standard accessories, so maybe more around 13 grand for that one. But as always, I'd love to know what you think of it down in the comments below. I think that it's a really great looking bike and one that's aging well the more times I look at it. It's just very tastefully done, and there's nothing too loud about it, but it's also interesting to look at, and it does look very nicely finished too. I really can't wait to check one out in the flesh, and also I'd love to take one out for a spin. So yeah, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and if you're new here and you want to see more videos like this, hit subscribe and I'll catch you in the next one.